Hey everyone, Aaron here from MTGChallengers and welcome to another Magic the Gathering deck tech. Today I'll be going over Gruul monsters for Born of the Gods Standard. So this is what I would call a red-green mid-range deck. It just plays all the biggest and best creatures in the colors, with a few spells to complement them. This is Cole's deck, but I really like it and enjoy playing it. There have been a lot of other green decks that run off of things like Garrett Caller of Beasts and Burning Tree Emissary, and just rely on devotion a lot more. I just feel like this deck is better and more consistent overall. So let's get started with the creatures, which are the bulk of this deck. I have one 1-drop in the form of a playset of Elvish Mystic. Just a nice turn 1 mana dork. It accelerates you along, keeps you essentially a turn ahead of your opponent, or keeps up with your opponent if you're on the draw. It just lets you get out your big threats sooner, which is the #1 thing you want to do in this deck. And my favorite thing about him is that you can get out Domri and Courser of Kruphix on turn 2, which is just awesome. Now onto the 2-drop, which is also a mana dork, Sylvan Caryatid, 4 copies of it as well. Another staple for green-based mid-range decks. It's a fine blocker with a 3 toughness, it's going to stay around a while with the hexproof, and it fixes you really well since it does add 1 mana of any color. Onto the 3-drop I have, which is Courser of Kruphix, a playset there as well. This card is just awesome, especially for this deck. If there's 2 things this deck wants to do, it's to draw all of your awesome creatures and hit all your land drops so you can play them, and he helps you do both. Playing lands from the top of your library is awesome for deck thinning and mana fixing, and his synergy with Domri Rade's +1 ability is just sick. And for the icing on the cake, he has 4 toughness, which makes him a fine blocker. It also lets him dodge things like Bile Blight and Lightning Strike. Now onto the 4-drops, we're getting into the main win conditions here. I have a playset of Ghor-Clan Rampager. It's just a value creature in every way. For just 2 mana, you can give a creature +4/+4 and trample, which is just huge. You can do it to things with evasion, like Stormbreath Dragon, to just get in there for a lot of damage, or to Polukranos. Since he doesn't have trample, they normally can just chump block him all day, but making him a 9/9 trampler, and possibly more for his monstrous, can be just devastating. And even if you don't have any awesome creatures on the battlefield to pump up, you can just play him as a 4/4 trampler for 4, which is still really solid. Then I have the usual playset of Polukranos World Eater. He's definitely one of the staples of green creature decks in Standard right now, and that's no exception here. 5/5 for 4 is already awesome, but he's also a huge mana sink in the late game that can outright board wipe your opponent and win you the game. Late game with decks like these, you'll just have a ton of mana between Nykthos and all the lands that you've played and all your mana dorks, so you can just pump all that mana into him and make him just absolutely massive and kill all the creatures that would be able to block him. Even though he's legendary, you really want to see him every game, so he's a definite playset. Onto the 5-drops, I have 4 Stormbreath Dragon. Just another insane card. 5 mana for a 4/4 flyer with haste is already awesome, but the protection from white and the monstrous ability just push him way over the top. With his evasion, he's an ideal target for pump spells like the Rampager and Xenagos, and he can win the game on his own oftentimes. Then I have the last creature in the form of 2 copies of Xenagos, God of Revels. He's just crazy good, especially in a big creature deck like this one. My favorite thing to do with him is to play a turn 4 Stormbreath Dragon, swing in for 4, and then play Xenagos next turn and swing in for another 8. That's 12 damage just from that one creature in 2 turns, which is just insane. You can use his ability the turn he comes into play, which is really important, and as you play your guys after him, he gives each and every one of them haste and just pumps them up to make them massive. He also, of course, can become a 6/5 and bash in along with your other creatures, but his ability is so good that you honestly don't even care about that most of the time. It's just awesome to have him in this deck. Then I have my spells. First off, I have 3 Mizzium Mortars. It's a really good removal spell for this deck. It gets rid of most relevant creatures in Standard right now. The bigger ones, especially like Blood Baron of Vizkopa, Stormbreath Dragon, and Courser of Kruphix in the mirror matchup, as well as things like Archangel of Thune. And the overload is really nice. Since the deck does play off of Nykthos a little bit, it won't actually be very restrictive at all. Then I have 1 copy of Flesh and Blood, obviously only using it for blood. It's just a one-of since it's fairly circumstantial, but when it works, man, it works. We of course have a lot of big creatures in the deck, and you can really capitalize on that with blood. You can cast its second main phase after a Xenagos pump, or a Rampager discard, and just deal a ton of damage, a lot of times even enough for lethal. and it's good in the mirror matchup since it can deal the damage to creatures as well, so you can kill huge things like monstrous Polukranoses, things you just normally wouldn't be able to deal with. So now on to the Planeswalkers. I have 3 Domri Rade, just an awesome walker for this deck. You can get him out turn 2 with a Mystic, and he starts giving you card advantage right away. With the Coursers and Scrylands in the deck, as well as running 26 creatures, his +1 ability is very nearly just draw a card. And his -2 is also awesome. It's some removal for the deck. Since we're running, again, a lot of huge creatures, our creatures are definitely going to be winning most of the time in the event of a fight. And if you get his ultimate off, winning is just a certainty. Then I have 2 copies of Xenagos the Reveler, a really good walker as well for this deck. He works particularly well with his god counterpart. If you have both of them out, it's just really cool because he gives 2 devotion to him, and you can just 0 him for 4/4s with haste, which is awesome. And that's usually the ability I end up using. I generally just 0 him over and over and just get a bunch of dudes. It's really nice to just get in some extra damage, or just to have a chump blocker for next turn. But if you do have a lot of guys out, have a lot of devotion, you can +1 him and make a bunch of mana to do just about anything you want. And finally, I have 1 Chandra Pyromaster. Pretty solid here, not as good as Domri or Xenagos, but still pretty nice. Her +1 is awesome. It's basically always going to be good, because if it's a little weenie creature, it'll kill it, and even if it's a bigger one, it will disable it so you can swing in. Her 0 ability works really well with the Courser and with Scry 1, since you'll know what's on top of your library a lot of the times before you use it. It can also thin your deck out as well. And then there's her ultimate, which is really pretty awful for the deck, honestly. We only have 4 instants and sorceries in here, so chances are you won't even hit them at all. But if you do, it is pretty cool. You'll board wipe them with a bunch of Mizzium Mortars, or you'll just kill them outright if you're lucky enough to hit the 1 blood. So that's it for the spells. Onto the mana base. I have the usual 8 dual lands, so 4 Stomping Ground and 4 Temple of Abandon, and then I have 3 copies of Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. The deck does still play off of Devotion a decent bit, so I wanted to run a few copies. It's just not as dependent on the Devotion interactions as past Gruul builds to win, which usually ran like a playset of it. And then I have 13 basics, which are 8 forests and 5 mountains. So a total of 24 lands, just the right amount for this deck. It's mid-range, so I wanted more than like an aggro deck would play, but I have a lot of alternate ways of producing mana with Nykthos, Xenagos, and the Mana Dorks, so I didn't think I needed anything more than 24. So that's it for the main deck. Let's move on to the sideboard. First off, I have 3 Mistcutter Hydra. It's always a great sideboard card for green decks against control decks and mono blue in particular. It basically can't be interacted with whatsoever if they're playing blue, and with all the mana this deck makes, he can be quite sizable most of the time. Then I have 2 Scavenging Ooze, mainly up against mono black and control decks. It can disrupt their Whip of Erebos interactions, which can be really irritating, and it can take advantage of a board wipe situation, so they like drop Supreme Verdict or Fated Retribution, and you play Scavenging Ooze and make it huge and gain a lot of life from all the creatures that died. It's also decent up against aggressive decks with the life gain. Then I have 3 Nylea's Disciple, just some more life gain up against the aggressive decks. It's also a fine blocker as well with the 3 toughness. And then I have some removal spells, so 1 more Mizzium Mortars, 1 more Flesh and Blood, and 2 Plummet. These are mainly up against the mirror matchup and or decks that just rely on huge creatures in the air. Blood can kill their huge stuff like monstrous Polukranoses. Mortars can take out their Coursers, Dragons, and Archangels of Thune against like white decks. And Plummet, of course, gets rid of anything that flies. And finally, I have 3 copies of Unravel the Aether. It's just an awesome way to get rid of bothersome enchantments like Detention Sphere and the Gods. It gets around their indestructibility so well, and it's really, really awesome to be able to have it here. So that's it for this deck tech. Thank you all very much for watching. To see these decks in action, check out our gameplays, and also be sure to keep up with the other decks that we cover. Thanks for visiting, and if you like what you see, subscribe for more Magic the Gathering content.